Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus our attention on Benchmark 1.7, explain how the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation led to the writing of the U.S. Constitution. In Part 1, we focus on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So our benchmark clarification will identify the weaknesses of the government under the Articles of Confederation, which included that Congress had no power to tax, to regulate trade, or to enforce its laws. The national government lacked a national court system, otherwise known as the judicial branch, and central leadership, otherwise known as the executive branch, no armed forces at the national level, and changes to the Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent of the 13 states. So what were the Articles of Confederation, and what were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? So first let's look at what were the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was the first government of the United States following the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence were colonists. They were declaring their independence through that document, but the document itself did not set up a government. After the Declaration of Independence was signed and proclaimed, that's when the colonists, now independent, got to work deciding what kind of government they were going to have. And they decided to have a confederal system. A confederation is a state-centered, decentralized government, which meant that the primary powers of government were held at the state level. A confederation was chosen in response to the British unitary government, under which the colonists were subjected to natural rights violations under King George III. So you may recall in your discussions about the preamble to the Declaration of Independence of the United States, where they say in the preamble that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Well, here we have the colonists saying, well, this government has destroyed our unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rather than alter it, we're going to create a new government. We're going to adopt a new form of government. And that new form of government was the Articles of Confederation, was a confederal or state-centered government. So you notice how the government that had been far away from the people, across an ocean, one king who abused his power, who was a tyrant, now we have power that's more local to the people because it is state-centered and decentralized, so the people could keep an eye on the government. So what were the weaknesses, though, of the Articles of Confederation? We know, for example, that the United States no longer lives under a confederation. So something must have happened. And what happened is that as much as the people wanted to be away from the abusive king, and they sort of took a very sharp reaction to that king by saying, the king's government is far away from us, we have no say in what happens there, so let's get the government close to us, and we can oversee the government and have a more of a say in how that government will function. And yet it turns out that that form of government was weak. So even though the form of government was chosen with good intentions, it turns out that the government was weak. So what were some of those weaknesses? One, the government did not have the power to tax, to regulate trade, or to enforce its laws. This meant that Congress was weak, the national legislature was weak because it lacked the power to raise money through taxes or to determine goods coming into and leaving the country. Because Congress did not have the power to make certain that the laws that it passed were enforced, that meant that there was this weak national legislature that couldn't oversee the good of the nation. The national government also lacked a national court system. Without a national court system or a judicial branch, there was no independent branch to rule on legal disputes. So after the Articles of Confederation were adopted, there were in essence 13 independent states that operated and functioned like 13 countries. So imagine, if you will, if a person is traveling from Massachusetts to Vermont and there's a different currency, but there's no set exchange rate. So one person would have difficulty traveling across state lines. Well, how do you bring goods across state lines if you don't have a way of determining the value of currency? You also had this idea that by operating in essence independently, each of these 13 states, that meant that if one state was attacked, that if they had a military that wasn't very strong or wasn't strong enough to fend off the attack, then that military was going to find its way to some of the other states. And operating as a confederation meant that there were these weaknesses that were a part of it. Well, among those weaknesses then was, what if there was a legal dispute between two states? What if there was a legal dispute about whether or not a river that served as a border between two states, who does the river belong to? And who decides how to use the river that creates the border for both of those states? So without an independent judiciary branch to rule on legal disputes, it created bad feelings between the states. The national government also lacked central leadership and an executive branch. Without a national executive branch, there was no way for laws that were passed by Congress to be enforced. So even though an executive branch would be separate from Congress, a weak executive branch also made for a weak legislative branch, because whatever Congress did, it did not have the power to enforce. There was also no national armed forces. Without a national armed forces, there was no way for there to be a national military response to outside threats. States were left to protect themselves. So imagine if there was an outside threat to the state of New York. Well, the natural geographic entry point for an outside threat would be coming from the water into New York City. And only New York City could defend itself, possibly other military from the state of New York. But guess what? If there's a water entry point to New York City and the state of New York military is unable to defend itself, that outside threat is just going to keep finding its way into other states.